welcome back. Now we're going to talk about how to outmaneuver the enemy. In the previous video, we talked about outthinking your opponent. And then again, overall success in close combat requires squads and platoons to outthink, outmaneuver, and outfight your opponent. This one we're going to really focus on how do you outmaneuver the enemy. So in the last video, we talked about how the enemy will come up with a a great plan with certainty to bring about victory. Well, the quickest way to outmaneuver your opponent is if you're able to move faster than he is, and then you upend his plan. He's never able to get into action. So when you think about outmaneuvering, the overall concept that you need to really remember is speed kills. Speed. Everything is about how fast you can operate. And really, the person that, did such a great job in maturing this concept, and someone I really think a lot of is, John Boyd. Now, there's lots of videos on YouTube describing, his theory, the observe, orient, decide, and act OODA loop. I'm going to give it just real simplistically. If you want further, more information on it, lots of content out there, you can get better description. The so what is John Boyd developed what he would assert as a theory to win in dogfights, a theory to win in combat, and he believed that this theory was really how you bring you a decisive advantage over your opponent. And it was all about a decision-making loop. So when you notice when someone's trying to make a decision, and let's say a very easy decision, if I look down and I see that my boot is untied, I first observe my boot is untied. Then I make sense of it. Well, I need to tie my boot because I'll trip on it or it looks sloppy or whatever. I'm going to decide to tie my boot. I bend over and I tie it. Now, the time it took for me to observe that my boot was untied, then to make sense of it, or as he would call, orient, and then to decide that I need to tie my boot, and then act, that loop, there was a time there. So maybe from beginning of observe to act to done, maybe 10 seconds from that entire process. That 10 seconds time is important to understand because that is what he would call as the time, a decision-making loop, get into someone's decision-making loop. So about 10 seconds to observe, orient, decide, act, and do it. Now, if there's something occurs that I'm unfamiliar with, so immediately the light shut off and the building started to crumble, there would be a moment where I would be observing that the lights have shut off and this building seems to be crumbling, and I'd be trying to make sense of it for a while. What does this mean? Why is it crumbling? Is it really crumbling? Is this really happening? This is where a lot of times people get stuck, trying to make sense of it and come up with what it is and what does it look like, and then try to come up with a decision, and then you take action to run out. If you notice, this part a lot of times is the part that takes the longest, is people making sense of it. But what's important of it is the time it requires to make a decision, knowing that the more someone is unfamiliar with what's happening, the longer the time is going to take. So to put that into kind of like a combat situation, if I go into somebody and let's say I have really trained myself and I understand, I'm really proficient with my firearm and I practice and I practice and I practice, and I've used scenario-based training, which is why scenario-based training is so effective, because it puts experiences in you. And I'm moving along in a wood line and immediately, a scenario occurs that I've practiced for, and two enemy soldiers immediately, appear, and I, have my weapon. I've done this react to contact drill very quickly. You'll notice that my decision-making loop of observe their action, orient, decide, and act can be very quick. And notice if the enemies has not observed till it's too late, they haven't oriented and they haven't made a decision, and I've already run the loop. I've already taken action, and they're still wondering what's happening. So the whole idea of this decision-making loop is you want your opponent's decision-making loop to be a lot longer and you to operate within it. And you can usually do that, like ideally, you want your decision-making loop to be somewhat like a laser, super focused, super fast. And you do this through experience, you do this through training, and so on and so forth. But operating and making decisions and observing, orienting, deciding, and acting quicker than your opponent is John Boyd's simplistic version of his theory. So when we talk about outmaneuvering the enemy, this is kind of the foundation of speed kills kind of idea. Okay, so now let's take a big picture like in warfare. So really what we're showing here is John Boyd's OODA loop is how this works with an army or with a combat unit. So observe. In order to make a decision, you must be able to see it occur, right? Though someone who sees the other first has really a decisive advantage. You see the enemy first. Think about hunting. When you see the deer first, everything's about a battle of detection. He who sees the other first has an advantage because you immediately start this loop. You start observing it. Most beneficial is for the commander himself to do his own reconnaissance. One of the things I think we fall into is we quickly always negate to map reconnaissance and software and get lazy about it. Nothing takes the advantage of you yourself as the commander personally observing the ground, personally up there observing for you see it for yourself. Why? Because it helps you move through this decision making much faster. You see it, you know what it looks like. But if you can't be there, then this is where we use our reconnaissance. We send our reconnaissance to be our eyes and ears to start this loop. They're going to go out to a named area of interest with a priority intelligence requirement that they're looking for and a task and a reporting of what they see to report back on it. Remember our deduction exercise. So your reconnaissance go out to observe. They're going to see it. They send the report back to the commander or the staff where they make sense of it, what it means. This is what this means, right? This is why, as if you want to get a black belt in this stuff, really what this is a method I use. You have to use the so what, therefore, I recommend. If you follow this, this will help you speed up the orient portion of this decision-making loop. So when your reconnaissance report out, they could say, I see such and such and such, or they could say, I see, 7 BMPs. So what is, we believe that is not the fixing unit because it's not enough of them. Therefore, we don't think this is where the enemy is going to send their fixing force. I recommend you look elsewhere or pay attention that this is not where that's going to occur. So what, therefore, I recommend rapidly make sense of what they're observing. Also, your staff, as they've done all their staff processes, they help you make sense of it. Therefore, it comes here where the commander or the decision maker immediately makes a decision. Oh, the enemy is coming through the South Pass. Then the time it takes for you to make that decision, issue an order, it gets to the unit, who then there's a time required for that unit to act. That it would be that entire decision-making loop. What you've got to focus into outmaneuver your enemy is how do you make this more swift? How do you make this more lean? How do you make this more efficient so you are operating in a very tight decision cycle or inside, use red, the enemy's decision cycle. And that is the goal. Always be inside the enemy's decision cycle. Observe, orient, decide, and act faster than he is. 1 second, 2 seconds faster makes a difference between life and death in most instances. This is the entire premise of the where we start with outmaneuvering the enemy. Of all everything I've practiced and trained and worked on really has led me to believe that John Boyd is absolutely right. This, if you really focus on getting this right and how much faster you can do this, whether you're wrestling, whether you're commanding a squad or platoon, you are outmaneuvering the enemy, remembering that speed kills. Now, one of the things, now we've introduced kind of the John Boyd's OODA loop. The next part of, so we have outmaneuvering the enemy, John Boyd's decision-making loop. Next, you need to understand what a position of advantage is. So the Army will always, one of the definitions the Army uses that drives me crazy is they says the purpose of the Army is to seize, retain, exploit the initiative to gain a position of relative advantage. I don't know what that is. So I think it's a super safe definition that encompasses everything, that says everything, so therefore to me it really says nothing. So let me try to give you some clarity on what a position of relative advantage is. What we're talking about almost all the time is the rear and the flank. This is best. This is pretty good. You get here, you are always at a position advantage. You get into the enemy's rear area, you're going to create psychological shock. You're going to have a decisive, this is the position advantage. Let me give you an example. So, if I had an opponent and I was fighting him here, front to front, where's the position advantage? Well, I could stand here and just punch each other and take it, or if any of you have done any combatives, you realize the most advantageous position on my opponent is when I get him into a rear naked choke. If you've ever been in a rear naked choke, you'll realize you don't have much time and it's pretty decisive. Once you get behind somebody and put them into a rear naked choke, you are definitely in a position of advantage. But how do you get there? Notice, if I have my opponent and I try to get around him, he will just move and continue fighting me. So really you need two people. One person to grab your opponent by the collar and rain punches on him to keep his focus and attentions forward. That would be what we call our fixing force. To grab him and threaten him with destruction if he doesn't ball up and put his hands up to protect him. That allows your partner to move in behind him and set in the rear naked choke, and you win. So when you think of position of advantage, think of the rear and the flank. But let's add it up a little bit, add a little more advanced thinking to this. So now there's lots of different warfighting functions. There's infantry, artillery, and all various. Well, what does it mean to me? Well, there's three really types of flanks. So a position advantage, if you look at rears and flank, there's three types of them. So one, there's a geographic flank. There is a time flank. And there is a psychological flank. Geographic flank is just what I said. Geographically, you are trying to move to a position advantage, either to their side or behind them. Geographically, get behind your enemy, attack them from behind. If you do that, you'll be in a position of advantage. A time flank. The best way it's ever been described to me with a time flank is this. It is a myth that your enemy is always ready. Just like everyone else, you have times when you're ready for combat, but most of the time we all spend our time in perpetual unreadiness. What I mean by that? Let's say in a 24-hour day. So this is 24 hours. How much of that 24 hours is an infantry battalion truly ready to fight? Well, they spend some of your time sleeping, some of your time eating, some of your time is going to be moving, some of your time is going to be planning and issuing orders, some of your time is going to be maintenance, some of your time is going to be administrative. And really, of this, you'll see, as we dive into all your activities, very little of your time is actually when you are ready to fight. Very little of it. So we often think that, and one of the training scars that we have in the U.S. Army is, when do we always attack the OPFOR? When they're ready to fight. They're always in their foxholes, got their stretch and ready to fight it out. But that's a myth, because that's usually not realistic. Most of the time, everybody spends the preponderance of their time perpetually unready to fight. But how do you move from unready to ready? Well, there's a time requirement. So if you say this is unready, and over here is ready, what's in the middle? Well, there's time. At some point, there is some alarm. Alarm, the enemy is coming. And there's a time required for you to stand up, go grab your kit, put it on, grab your rifle, get your ammo, get out to your striker, and on and on. How long that takes is time to get you to ready. Now, if you're able to take advantage of that, and let's say it takes me 20 minutes from the time of enemy detection, alarm, to I am strapped up with my weapon locked and loaded, ready to fight. If I'm able to attack at 10 minutes, I've achieved a surprise. I'm at a position of relative advantage, because even though I'm coming, there's nothing they can really do about it. So it's being able to operate within that space of detection and the time when you're ready, where you achieve surprise, and that's when you're operating on a time flank. You gain a position of advantage by operating in the time between unready and ready, from when the enemy detects you and when they get to a state of readiness. If they're in a posture where it takes 30, 40 seconds, not very small, hard time flank. You got them in 20, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, days, a lot to play with, and that is a time flank. Lastly is a psychological flank. This is where you operate in when you hit someone where they're least expecting it. Go after someone where it creates shock. Shock happens when someone doesn't know what to do. That is the platinum, or the best of what you in infantry try to do, is create shock within your opponent. That is hitting someone where they least expect it, when they, as hard as you, what did Willie and Slim say? There's only one principle of war, and that's this: hit the other guy as hard as you can, as quick as you can, where it hurts him the most, when he least expects it. And that's really getting after the psychological flank, which is your whole goal is to create shock. We don't talk about this enough in the U.S. Army. We talk about destroying things, but we really never focus on the will to fight and the enemy's desire to fight. That's what this is about. Shock creates panic. Shock creates confusion. When something happens and all of a sudden you get hit with an overwhelming amount of violence from an unexpected direction, it creates panic, especially when it's from behind or when it's from your rear area. You'll see it all the time, example after example, where the soldiers are brave, ready to fight, and then they get reports that the enemy's behind them, destroying their wagon train, destroying their supplies, destroying their headquarters. And in that moment, everybody changes. They become confused. They start sending messages to, hey, what do we do? With no answer. When that happens and they get no answer, they become paralyzed. And paralysis leads to fear, panic leads to confusion, and then you create hopelessness, and hopelessness leads to defeat. That entire sequence is what you're aiming at when you create shock. This is the power of getting into an enemy's rear area, destroying their critical vulnerabilities, i.e. their headquarters, destroying their artillery, destroying the enemy commander, creating that panic of soldiers not knowing what to do. Think of the Gulf War. In the Gulf War, we did a really good job cutting the enemy's communication, keeping them talking amongst themselves. What happened? Soldiers surrendered en masse. And that's when you know you're creating shock. It's not counting bodies, it's counting prisoners of war. And this is done really by going and targeting the enemy's critical vulnerabilities. So what I've described is how you gain a position advantage over your opponent is really operating inside his OODA loop, gaining the position advantage, which is usually his flanks and his rear. So how we in the dark rifles depict that. So typically what we do, we show this model. So you have an enemy. Remember, in order to get a position advantage and to get behind somebody, you first need a force to move up and to grab them by the collar, to rain blows on it and to keep them in place. Once that happens, that allows your enemy, that allows you to move toward their flanks, or ideally, get to their rear area. We fix them, so we first hunt and find the enemy. Once we do that, we fix them, and then we race to their flanks. And then we get behind them where we outfight them to kill and capture the enemy. And that's where we come up with hunt, race, kill. So when you hear the words hunt, race, kill, we find the enemy, race their flanks, and then kill them by getting behind them and attacking their critical vulnerabilities to create shock. So in summary, how do you outmaneuver the enemy is really, we here at the Dark Rifle War, or us at the Dark Rifles, we really focus on John Boyd's OODA loop to really take advantage of speed kills and to operate inside your opponent's decision making. Then we get to a position advantage, which is almost always to their rear area or to their flank. In order to do that, you need someone to grab them by the collar and to fix them by raining blows frontally to allow them to get behind, and that gains your position advantage. If you can't do that geographically, perhaps you can do that through time and to hit them before you want to postpone your detection. And keep it where and postpone your detection until you're within a time that you're able to strike before they are ready. And lastly, as you attack their critical vulnerabilities, their command nodes, their artillery, their logistics, their fuelers, so on and so forth, that's their critical vulnerability that will create shock. And those are the three types of flanks that we want to attack: geographically, time, and psychologically. Okay? That's how you outmaneuver.